Okay, so today we're finally going to get to Thomas Apologia's modal collapse argument or aloneness argument against divine simplicity. Very requested video, so let's get right into his outline of the case.
The following argument establishes that classical theism entails metaphysical necessitarianism, because under classical theism, God is identical to his knowledge. The contents of God's knowledge, therefore, must be identical to himself, and thus are also metaphysically necessary. Basically, it's impossible that the contents of God's knowledge could have been different. If this is the case, then what the contents of God's knowledge are about also become metaphysically necessary.
All right, so that was his outline of the case. So remember, he's supposed to be proving that classical theism leads to necessitarianism. So what we're going to do here is we're first going to give an analogy, a visualization that is directly analogous to one of the arguments, or specifically fundamentally the argument he is making in his video. And then we're going to pull that argument explicitly to show that that is one-to-one with the analogy that I'm giving to show the hidden assumption of necessitarianism. Then we're going to interrogate what he thinks is supporting that with his epistemic discrimination argument. And then we're going to show that his argument fundamentally has absolutely nothing to do with divine omniscience or any contents of God's mind. Rather, he just assumes necessitarianism, and he just assumes indeterminacy makes no sense, which is what he's supposed to be proving. So here's our visualization. So here you have one box and it has one button, and the button is not labeled. And 5 times you press the box and it spawns, let's say, a red paint. And the other time, 5 times you press the box, it spawns blue paint. But in the times that you pressed the button both times, nothing about the box, the surrounding environment, nothing changed. It just spawned different paint. Now, Thomas looks at this and it makes him uncomfortable. And he says something must be wrong. So he provides another model. He says we have 2 boxes, each of which have a distinct button labeled red, and it's a red button, and another box labeled blue, and it's a blue button. And they have differing mechanics. And 10 times out of 10, Thomas presses the red button and it spawns red paint. The other 10 times out of 10, he presses the blue box's blue button and it spawns blue paint, right? Problem fixed, right? Well, let's take a closer look. What made Thomas uncomfortable in the first box? Well, what made him uncomfortable was that there's an indeterministic link between the button and its effects. Nothing about the intrinsic contents of the box fixes any outcome. It can be red or blue, right? And so Thomas looks at that, and the indeterminacy in itself is what he's trying to fix. So he creates 2 separate boxes. Now, if we don't assume indeterminacy or determinacy here, there's nothing stopping the box or the red box from spawning blue paint, even though he's created 2 separate boxes. Or the blue box with the blue button to spawn red paint, or both boxes to spawn the same red or blue paint, because the effect is not necessitated by its cause. So just splitting up the box into more boxes doesn't solve anything. Rather, he needs to assume that there's a necessary connection between the box's contents and whatever effect it produces through pressing the button, right? He has to assume necessitarianism. It has nothing to do with the boxes, splitting up boxes or whatnot. Keep that in mind. So notice this. If we had posited 2 boxes, but left indeterminacy in the picture as a possibility, he would still be running into the same problem. and there would be absolutely no reason to posit two boxes in his case. And so it's not the positing of boxes that comes before determining whether necessitarianism or indeterminism is true in the case of what type of causation is occurring here. Rather, he already assumed that indeterminism made him uncomfortable. He did not like it. And because of that, he posited that there must be two distinct boxes, because if there's two distinct outcomes or possibilities, he needs them to have distinct contents. Because if box A, which is the blue button, is necessarily tied to blue paint, that excludes the possibility of the effect of pressing the button being red paint. And so if he wants to posit the possibility of red paint, he needs a box with a red button that produces a red paint, right? But he is only doing this because he has to first assume indeterminism is false. Because he's assuming it already, that necessitarianism is true, it forces him to create distinct boxes if we want to consider the possibility of distinct effects. And so we go from the assumption of necessitarianism to distinct boxes, as opposed to having distinct boxes first, or a single box first, and then coming to the conclusion that necessitarianism or determinism is true or false.
And world 2. So we just talked about in world 1, God knows that X, and in world 2, God knows that not X. Well, since the aboutness condition is intrinsic and God is intrinsically the same in both worlds, it follows that the condition for both contradictory knowledge predicates is identical and obtains in both worlds. So remember, according to this horn of the dilemma, the classical theist is wanting to say that, okay, what fixes it that God knows that X? What has to obtain for God to know that X, for that that contingent knowledge predicate to be true about God's knowledge? The only thing that really needs to obtain is just what is identical to God himself. So since under this hypothesis, if such an aboutness condition obtains, then the predicate it fixes also does, as when we're asking about an aboutness condition, we're asking about what has to obtain in reality for these knowledge predicates to be true. It follows that if the divine essence obtains, and so do the predicates knowing and not knowing X. However, that results in a contradiction. Again, why does knowing X have to be a true predicate of God and not knowing X have to be a true predicate of God in this case? Well, because knowing X and not knowing X has the same condition to be truly predicated of God's knowledge, which is just God himself obtaining. And you'll notice that for any contradictory contingent knowledge predicates, this will be the case. So we have a big issue on.
All right, so here he's giving his argument explicitly laid out, and hopefully your intuitions have been triggered in accordance with the visualization we just provided. So what is he saying here? So he's saying if you have an aboutness condition, here he says C, and in this example, he's trying to represent the classical theist who says that God, the condition of God knowing whatever, is just him knowing himself, right? So there's one condition, similar to how in the visualization, there's a box with one button. And he says that, well, under the classical theist's view, if the condition to bring about world one or X, which is a contingent state of affair, is the same condition that brings about not X or a different state of affair, right? Because remember, nothing about the condition is changing, just like in the visualization. Nothing about the box is changing, because the box, when you press the button, it can bring about red paint, but it can also bring about not red paint, right? Blue paint. He's saying if the condition is the same, then when you press the button, when you activate the condition in this example, he's saying that necessarily both worlds, right, both X and not X, both red and blue, come about. Remember, he's saying necessarily they come about, right? That's how he's saying that it follows from this that there's a contradictory set of predicates that obtain. But notice this. Again, he has to assume necessity between the content and its effects in order to derive the conclusion that if there's differing effects that are tied to the same content, if you activate that content, then therefore it necessarily activates both distinct effects simultaneously. Now remember, referring back to the original example of the box that I gave, the box, even though it produces two outputs, does not necessarily produce both outputs at the same time. To his epistemic discrimination argument, because if you try to challenge the fact of his assumption, which is that he's assuming a deterministic link between the aboutness condition or the content or the button in our visualization and its effect, if you try to question that, he will point towards, as he does in his video, his earlier discrimination argument. Premise 1 reads as, if God's knowledge contains no determinate representation of which world is actual, then all possible worlds are epistemically indiscriminable to God. Well, why is that? Well, maybe because he defined an aboutness condition as needing to necessitate its effect, right? Because according to him, if it does not necessitate its effect, it does not rule out X as opposed to not X. And so when you activate it, it would trigger both X and not X. But again, what's required for that line of reasoning to go through? Well, you have to assume that if the condition came about, that it would activate both X and not X, right? In the case of the classical theist, we believe God has one content that's intrinsic to him, which is just his act of knowing himself, of which he knows all possible worlds and all actual states of affairs through knowing his power and will. And all of this is known immediately, right? God does not discriminate in the discursive sense between propositions, between worlds in the way that we think about it. Rather, God has one aboutness condition or content, as he defines it, that's intrinsic to him, right? The object of his knowing is himself. Through knowing himself, he knows possible worlds. That's when we say, in world 1, where X is true, God knows that X. In world 2, where X is not true, God knows that not X. But the will is sufficient for bringing about both X and not X, but it does not determine either. So his argument does not reach the conclusion that by activating the condition, it brings about both states of affairs. And when he tries to fall back on his epistemic discrimination argument, this is only an argument because he defined an aboutness condition as necessitating its effect. So this isn't actually a second argument. All he's saying really here is that if aboutness conditions fix contents or effects, if aboutness conditions fix effects and there's differing effects, then there needs to be differing contents. And then he's saying, if there is no differing intrinsic contents, then you cannot discriminate between differing effects. Well, notice that, again, he embedded the assumption of necessitarianism in his most fundamental defense of this entire video. He then takes that assumption and acts as if he's actually proved anything. So what's the conclusion of this all? Well, we're not going to go through his formalization in the beginning of the video because premise 4 is explicitly Premise 4 is explicitly a modal transfer fallacy. So we're not going to focus on that, on sort of the formal aspect of his argument, because he's complained about me doing that before. And we're not going to focus on the second premise, which is really the issue, because it is loaded with his sort of necessitarian definitions of content and whatnot. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on something that he says would debunk his whole video from the start: the causal theory of knowledge that the classical theist believes in, of which he responds in the first objection 1 part of his video.
Contingent truths by perfectly knowing himself and perfectly knowing his will. But because God causes all contingent truths, if God perfectly knows his will, God perfectly knows everything he causes, and voila, voila, abracadabra, God knows all contingent truths. So how can we respond to this? This response, however, ultimately does not succeed. Firstly, the response presupposes that God not only knows his intrinsic will, but that God knows what he does with his will only by knowing his will intrinsically. And this is very problematic. So to demonstrate this, consider that no matter what God does with his will under classical theism, nothing about the will intrinsically changes. So what really enables God to know what he does with his will? If the will is exactly the same, no matter what he does with it, and he knows changing things via his will, how does he know what he causes with his will? I mean, his will never actually represents anything that he causes. And if it does represent anything it causes, then it just shifts the site of the modal collapse, because then there is a representational content in God's will. That's now identical to God. Now that's necessary. You get the same argument.
So his response is fairly disappointing. He says if the intrinsic content, or if the differing effects have the same cause, nothing about the cause changes. He then asks the question, well then, what explains the difference in the effect? And he says this is an issue, right? Well, why is he saying this is an issue? Well, because for him, discrimination requires differences in the cause, right? A difference in effect for him requires a difference in the cause. So if there are 2 worlds, world 1 must be indexed to something in God that is distinct from whatever world 2 is indexed to. Now remember, this seems at first glance to solve the issue, but remember the box example, right? Splitting 1 box into 2 boxes seems to resolve the issue, but in itself never resolve the issue, because you then have to assume necessity between the cause and its effects. So it's not just that there's something distinct in God which corresponds to distinct effects, which he's acting like is the real solution to the issue at hand, but rather something more fundamental has to happen. He has to first assume a link of necessity between the distinct causes in God and their effects. Otherwise, there would be no point in creating distinct internal contents in God, or in the example we gave, there would be no point in creating more boxes if you allowed for indeterminacy, since distinct boxes with distinct mechanics could produce, in theory, the same paint, right? The blue button, the red button could both produce red paint or blue paint, even though they have differing mechanics. And so he acts as if that gets rid of the objection, asking the question, when really we're coming full circle, right? The discrimination argument, he then uses it again, and he says he can modify it using the will, but we've already shown that his discrimination argument relies upon rather defining discrimination already in terms of necessity, then acting as if he's concluding necessity by using it. And so he never really debunks anything concerning his whole video relies upon. So really, the entire video then is just question begging, is it not? If he has to assume determinism is true to get any of his definitions, arguments off the ground, he never concludes necessitarianism is true. He just assumes it from the outset.